When self-proclaimed HOA guards threatened a father's teenage daughter with a gun over a petty neighborhood dispute, they had no idea she wasn't just any woman. She was a retired Delta Force operator. What followed wasn't just a confrontation. It became a shocking lesson in respect, justice, and survival. The neighborhood had always looked perfect from the outside: freshly painted homes, manicured lawns, a community pool, and the kind of streets real estate brochures loved to feature under bold letters reading "safe, family-friendly living." But beneath the polished surface was an HOA that acted less like a neighborhood association and more like a petty kingdom. They had rules for everything: the shade of curtains visible from the street, the number of cars you could park in your driveway, and even how tall your grass was allowed to grow before you'd get a warning. And while most people ignored their letters or grumbled about the fines, the HOA's board had recently taken their delusions of authority to the next level, hiring a group of so-called private security guards who roamed the neighborhood in golf carts and unmarked SUVs. They weren't police, but they dressed in tactical vests, carried radios, and strutted around like they were on patrol in a war zone. To the neighbors, they were laughable. To me, they were a nuisance. But to my daughter, they became something far worse. My daughter, Emma, had returned home only a year ago after retiring early from her military service. Most of the neighborhood knew her as a quiet, polite woman in her early 30s who jogged every morning, waved to neighbors, and sometimes helped people carry groceries. What they didn't know, because she rarely talked about it, was that she had spent over a decade in Delta Force, the most elite and secretive counterterrorism unit in the U.S. military. She'd led missions in the Middle East that no one would ever read about in newspapers, disarmed bombs under fire, extracted hostages, and dismantled networks of men who thought they were untouchable. Emma carried herself with a calm confidence, the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to be announced. But to these self-appointed guards, she was just another resident they could intimidate. It started on a Friday evening when Emma parked her truck near the community park after returning from running errands. She was wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt, carrying a couple of grocery bags when two men in black tactical vests stepped out of a golf cart and blocked her path. They had patches on their chest that read HOA Security in bold white letters, but there was nothing official about them. "Ma'am, this isn't a public parking area," one of them barked, his hand resting on the side of his hip where a pistol sat holstered. Emma raised an eyebrow, calm and unbothered. "Really? I've lived here since last year, and I've always parked here when unloading. It's community property." The taller guard smirked like he had just been challenged in front of an audience. "Not anymore. HOA rules. You're gonna need to move your vehicle immediately." She didn't flinch, didn't argue, just shifted her grocery bag to her other hand. "I'll move it once I bring my things inside. It'll take me 5 minutes. That should have been the end of it. Any rational person would have let her go. But these men weren't rational. They were bullies drunk on the little power they thought they had. The second guard, shorter and stockier, stepped closer. "Listen, lady, you move it now, or we'll have your truck towed. And if you resist, you're trespassing." Emma let out a small laugh, the kind that wasn't mocking but dangerous in its restraint. "Trespassing? On my own property?" Her calmness only seemed to enrage them further. The tall one pulled his radio from his belt and spoke into it like he was coordinating some high-level operation. "We've got a non-compliant resident at the park entrance. Might need backup." Emma tilted her head, watching, analyzing, not scared, just calculating. She could disarm both men in under 5 seconds if she wanted to, but for now, she let them puff their chests. It wasn't until the shorter guard's hand twitched toward his holster that the situation crossed a line. "You're not listening," he growled. "Step away from the vehicle and—" His sentence froze midair because Emma had dropped her groceries at her feet, and in one fluid motion, her hand closed around his wrist before he even touched his weapon. It happened so fast that the taller guard blinked in confusion. Emma twisted his wrist in a subtle but firm grip that forced him to his knees without causing permanent damage. "Rule number 1, she said evenly, her voice quiet but cutting through the night. "Never reach for a weapon unless you're prepared to use it." The taller guard instinctively grabbed at his own pistol, But by the time his hand brushed the grip, Emma had already released his partner and stepped between them, standing tall, shoulders squared, her eyes locked with his. "You don't want to do that," she said simply. The weight in her tone wasn't a threat. It was a fact, an inevitability. The taller guard hesitated, torn between his pride and his instincts, which screamed at him that this woman was not someone to test. He didn't lower his weapon, but he didn't draw it either. "You think you're tough?" he spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." Emma's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Actually, I do. You're just a man in a vest pretending to be something you're not. That's dangerous, for you." She picked up her groceries as if the altercation hadn't even happened and started walking toward our house, leaving them standing there speechless. But that wasn't the end of it. By the next morning, the HOA had sent out a community-wide email labeling Emma a hostile resident who had physically assaulted security staff. They painted her as a threat to the neighborhood, conveniently leaving out that their guards had been the aggressors. When I read the email, my blood boiled. My daughter had risked her life countless times for people who would never know her name, yet here she was being smeared by a group of wannabe enforcers with too much free time. Emma, though, wasn't rattled. She sipped her coffee like nothing had happened, and shrugged when I asked her how she wanted to respond. "They don't scare me, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "But if they pull that stunt again, I won't just walk away." And sure enough, the next encounter wouldn't just be intimidation, it would be escalation. The HOA's smear email didn't have the effect they intended. Instead of turning the neighborhood against Emma, it sparked whispered conversations, side glances, and cautious respect from the people who had seen the guards patrolling too aggressively. A few neighbors even came by to quietly thank her for standing up to them, but others stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. The guards, however, weren't about to let their egos take a public beating. A few nights later, it all came to a head. Emma had gone for her usual evening run around the community. It was late summer and the sky was painted in streaks of fading orange, the cicadas humming in the thick air. I was sitting on the porch, watching her silhouette in the distance, when I noticed an unmarked SUV crawling behind her at a slow pace. My gut twisted. Two of the guards stepped out when she slowed at the corner, and even from a distance, I could see the aggression in their stance. They weren't there to talk. I stood up, ready to head down the street, but before I could, one of them drew his gun. The sound of a pistol cocking carried through the humid evening like thunder. "Hands where I can see 'em," the taller guard barked, his voice breaking the calm of the street. Neighbors peeked out through blinds and cracked open doors, frozen in shock. These men weren't cops. They had no right to point a firearm at anyone. But ego and fear had blinded them to common sense. Emma stopped mid-step, her breathing steady from the run, not from fear. She slowly raised her hands, palms open, her eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. The shorter guard circled around her, his own pistol drawn, while the taller one kept his weapon leveled at her chest. "HOA rules," the shorter one sneered. "You assaulted one of us. Now you're resisting security protocol. You're under citizen's arrest." The absurdity of his words almost made me laugh from where I stood, but my heart was pounding too fast to find any humor in it. Emma tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You really want to point a gun at a resident in a neighborhood full of witnesses and call that protocol?" Her calmness only fueled their rage. The taller guard's finger twitched near the trigger, his breathing uneven. He wanted control, but Emma's unshakable composure unnerved him. That's when everything snapped into motion so quickly that the neighbors later described it like watching lightning strike. In one smooth movement, Emma dropped low, pivoting on her heel, and twisted the taller guard's wrist before he could react. The gun clattered to the pavement, and in the same breath, she kicked it several feet away. The shorter guard panicked and lunged forward, but Emma was already on him, redirecting his weapon skyward with a precision that came from years of training under fire. He pulled the trigger in desperation, the shot ringing out into the night sky, harmless but loud enough to make windows shatter from the vibration. Gasps echoed across the street as neighbors screamed, ducked, and scrambled back into their homes. But Emma didn't flinch. She locked his arm, disarmed him in a fluid motion, and had him on the ground, face pressed to the asphalt, before the echo of the gunshot faded. The taller guard stumbled back, clutching his wrist, too stunned to move. Emma stood between them, both weapons now in her hands, held with the kind of confidence that made it clear she didn't need them to be dangerous. "Let me make this crystal clear," she said, her voice firm enough to carry across the block. "You are not law enforcement. You are not military. You are not authorized to harass, intimidate, or endanger residents of this community. You point another weapon at me or anyone else here, and I won't stop at disarming you." She dropped the magazines from both pistols, tossed the empty shells into the grass, and slid the weapons down the street like scraps of trash. Then she stepped back, giving them the chance to walk away with what was left of their pride. But instead of retreating, the taller guard pulled out his radio, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. "All units, she attacked us again! Armed suspect, need backup now!" His voice cracked with desperation. Armed suspect. That one lie was enough to escalate everything beyond repair. Within minutes, more SUVs and carts screeched into the cul-de-sac, a half-dozen more guards piling out, some carrying bats, others armed with pistols. They formed a loose semicircle around Emma, who stood calm in the middle of the street, her posture relaxed but her eyes scanning every angle. I rushed forward, yelling, "Stop! She's unarmed! You're out of your minds!" But they ignored me, their focus locked on Emma. The leader of the group, a broad-chested man with graying hair and a cheap badge pinned to his vest, stepped forward. "On the ground now!" he barked. "You've assaulted security officers twice. You're a danger to this neighborhood." Emma didn't move. She didn't even blink. "What I am," she said, her voice low and steady, "is someone who spent years protecting this country from real threats. And what you're doing is reckless, dangerous, and illegal. Put your weapons down before you regret this." Her words carried an authority that unsettled even the toughest of them, but pride is a blinding thing. One of the younger guards raised his pistol, trembling with adrenaline. The graying leader gave a small nod. That was their mistake. Emma exploded into motion, faster than any of them could follow. She closed the gap between herself and the trembling guard, disarmed him in under a second, and used his own momentum to throw him off balance. She didn't attack for the sake of hurting them. Every move was precise, calculated, and controlled, designed to neutralize without unnecessary harm. Within moments, 2 more were on the ground, groaning, their weapons kicked away. The remaining guards faltered, their formation breaking as doubt and fear crept in. They weren't facing an ordinary woman. They were facing someone trained to operate in conditions far harsher than any suburban street could offer. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, sirens wailed in the distance. Real sirens. Police. Neighbors had called 911 the second the first gun was drawn, and now flashing blue and red lights painted the street. The HOA guards froze, caught in their own illusion of authority crumbling. The officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Drop your weapons! Hands in the air!" For a tense second, it looked like the chaos might spiral further, but Emma calmly raised her hands and stepped back, her eyes never leaving the guards. The police swarmed in, separating everyone, demanding explanations, and that's when the truth began to unravel. Witnesses poured out of their homes, recounting every detail, the guards drawing first, Emma defending herself, the lies over the radios. One by one, the HOA's narrative crumbled under the weight of reality. The officers secured the guards' weapons, took statements, and promised an investigation. But as they loaded the humiliated guards into cruisers, Emma stood silent, her jaw tight, her chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. She had faced down worse than this, but I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to back down quietly. And Emma? She wasn't about to let them terrorize another family again. The fallout from that night rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave. By sunrise, word had spread to every doorstep, every group chat, and every whisper over backyard fences. The once feared HOA guards had been hauled off in police cars, their weapons confiscated, their credibility shattered, but the board wasn't ready to surrender their power. Within days, the HOA president released a statement to the entire community, claiming Emma was a dangerous aggressor who had endangered lives and resisted lawful authority. They threatened legal action, fines, even the possibility of eviction. What they didn't count on was the storm they had awakened. You see, Emma had spent her career not just fighting wars, but navigating the politics of operations most people would never know about. She understood intimidation, manipulation, and lies better than anyone. And more importantly, she understood how to dismantle them. Instead of cowering, Emma contacted a lawyer, one of her old military comrades who had left Delta to practice law, specializing in civil rights and veteran protections. Together, they compiled evidence, video doorbell footage from neighbors showing the guards drawing weapons first, audio recordings of the gunshot fired skyward, sworn witness statements detailing Emma's restraint in the face of provocation. Every detail painted the HOA not as a governing body, but as a reckless militia. Meanwhile, the local news caught wind of the story. It started with a short segment on the evening broadcast. Neighborhood security escalates into armed standoff. But once the words, "retired Delta Force operator," appeared on the Chiron, the story exploded. Suddenly, reporters were camped outside the neighborhood gates, demanding answers from the HOA. Questions like, why does a homeowners association need armed guards? And who authorized civilians with no training to carry weapons in a residential area, hammered them from every angle. The board tried to hide behind closed meetings, issuing vague denials, but the pressure only mounted. Parents were furious. Elderly residents who once feared speaking out now demanded resignations. Families who had been bullied into fines or harassed for petty rule violations came forward with stories of intimidation. The fragile empire of control the HOA had built over the years was crumbling brick by brick. Still, the board doubled down. They filed a restraining order against Emma, claiming she was a violent threat to the community. But when the case reached the courthouse, their narrative unraveled spectacularly. The judge watched the video evidence in silence, her expression hardening with every passing second. When it ended, she looked directly at the HOA's attorney and asked one pointed question. Are you seriously suggesting this woman, who demonstrated discipline, restraint, and acted only in self-defense against armed aggressors, is the threat here? The silence that followed was deafening. The restraining order was denied on the spot. Instead, the judge ordered a formal investigation into the HOA's practices, including their authorization of armed guards. That was the turning point. Within weeks, the so-called security force was dismantled, their contracts terminated, their leader facing charges for reckless endangerment and unlawful possession of firearms on private property. Several board members quietly resigned under the pressure, while others clung desperately to their titles until lawsuits and community votes forced them out. For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to breathe freely again. But for Emma, it wasn't about victory or revenge. She never once gloated, never once rubbed her triumph in anyone's face. She continued her morning runs, waved to neighbors, and lived with the same quiet strength she always had. One evening, after weeks of chaos, I asked her if she ever regretted stepping in that first night with the guards. She sat on the porch, the fading sun casting a golden light across her face, and she shook her head slowly. "No, Dad," she said softly. "I spent years fighting for people I didn't know in places far away. If I couldn't stand up for people here, my own neighbors, then what was all that training for?" There was a long silence between us, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the distant laughter of children finally allowed to play outside without fear of harassment. And then came the moment that sealed it all. At the next community-wide meeting, held under police supervision to prevent further intimidation, Emma stood in front of the gathered residents and spoke. She didn't raise her voice, didn't boast about her background, didn't humiliate the board members still present. Instead, she spoke with clarity and conviction. Security is about protection, not control. Authority is about service, not power. And respect is earned, not demanded. This neighborhood doesn't need people in tactical vests with guns to be safe. It needs people willing to look out for one another. Her words struck deeper than any threat could have. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now stood taller, emboldened. The HOA's reign of fear was broken not just by legal battles, but by the unity of a community reminded of its own strength. By the end of that meeting, the HOA had voted to dissolve its security program permanently. Emma returned home that night to a quiet house, but not before several neighbors stopped her, shaking her hand, thanking her, telling her how she had inspired them. For me, watching my daughter handle the chaos with such grace, discipline, and quiet power was both humbling and awe-inspiring. She hadn't just defended herself, she had changed an entire community. The so-called guards had pulled a gun on the wrong woman. What they discovered too late was that they hadn't been facing a victim. They had been facing a warrior who refused to let fear rule her home. And in the end, it wasn't brute force or violence that dismantled them. It was the unshakable calm of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. And that's how a group of self-proclaimed HOA guards learned the hard way that power without purpose is nothing, and that underestimating the wrong person can change everything. Emma's courage didn't just defend her, it set an entire community free. For more powerful true-to-life dramas, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Compass Stories, where every tale uncovers strength, justice, and the unexpected heroes among us.